Wisconsin has it under NR 600.
You want to stick
Well, maybe this won't work.
Yeah, go ahead and we'll move them for you. There you go.
Yeah, that's not working. So what they did is they look at all the different chemicals that you have that we're talked about over here or in industry. And they said anything that's toxic over a certain level, we're going to regulate that. Anything's flammable, obviously we want to regulate that. Explosives, anything that's corrosive, either really acid or really base, we want to regulate that. Anything that's an environmental hazard, that if it gets into the groundwater or if it gets into streams, it causes pollution, we want to regulate that. And then they said that certain things from certain industries are going to be regulated no matter what. Next slide. This is that Superfund cleanup, and this is what drove everything. It set you up as responsible parties, and it became very expensive, so you actually followed the regulations very closely. Next. You can be personally liable if you're taught how to do things. You have a system in place, but you choose to do something different. You can actually be held personally liable. We talked about the university. I dealt with them quite a while ago, and they were going out to the smaller clinics and picking up hazardous materials that were no longer needed, bringing them back in, consolidating them, and disposing of them as hazardous waste. They were doing it in their own personal cars, bringing things in. And I looked at them and I said, you know, this isn't a good idea. First of all, you've got all this stuff in a personal car, which, you know, your liability is really high here. So you should at least do it in a company vehicle. The other thing is, yeah, it's a product, and you can move it as a product. You don't need a hazardous waste transporter license. But it should be containerized, and it should be kept secure. You should also have some bill of lading so that if it's involved in an accident, people will know that all this hazardous stuff is in the back seat of the van or whatever. The other liability is that some of these people may have picked up some stuff, taken it home, and then the next morning taking it back to the university. And we said, you know, that just isn't a good idea. So they changed all of that, and things were done better. But let's say you did this anyways. Let's say you've got a lot of these flammable solvents and you take them home for a charcoal lighter fluid. And something that gets involved in an accident, you could be held personally liable. Next. If you look at all the waste that you generate, this is kind of where it all fits together, okay? You've got products up here, and if it's a product, you go to Menards and you buy it, it's not covered under the DOT because it's a small quantity. It's not covered as a hazardous waste. When you take it home and you use it, it becomes a regulated waste at that point, but you've got cleanup programs that take that stuff back, and you've got things that are involved with recycle of that material. You've got garbage and trash, and that's paper goods and garbage that you generate at a hospital. You've got hazardous waste over here, and those are pretty well defined. And if it's a hazardous waste, it's a hazardous waste, and by definition, there's where it is. So you don't have to worry too much about that. You've got things that go down the sewer in the labs, acetone, some alcohols, things like that. Those aren't really covered under hazardous waste. They're allowed to go into the sewer system because the POTW is going to dispose of it under their permit. You've got oil that doesn't have any hazardous components in it that can be recycled. You've got things that are recycled. I've got a hazardous waste. It's a used chemical. I've declared it a hazardous waste. It now becomes a hazardous waste. But all of a sudden you come up and you say, hey, over here at our lab, we can use that xylene that you were going to throw away. That can be recycled for its intended purposes. It's not a hazardous waste. You can keep it out of hazardous waste arena. Then you've got this group over here. Well, let's talk about universal waste first. Universal waste are things like bulbs, ballasts, electronic equipment.
Batteries.
What?
Batteries.
Batteries. If I would take this computer and I would grind it up like I do for any waste stream that I have, and I put it in a solution and I tumble it in like a rock tumbler for a day, and then I take that solution out. This is like it's been in a landfill for many, many years. And they analyze that for its smallest components. And if it fails, if it has lead over 5 parts per million, it becomes a hazardous waste. If it has certain things in there over a certain amount, it becomes a hazardous waste. And if I do that to my waste, and it's a hazardous waste, if I do that to the electronic goods, I'll find that that piece of equipment there will not pass TCLP. It'll have silver in there over the amount that's allowed to get into a landfill. It'll have cadmium. It'll have other heavy metals that might be in there. So that's actually a hazardous waste. The bulbs in here will have mercury over 0.2 of a part per million. Becomes a hazardous waste. Yes.
TCLP.
Toxic characteristic leachate parameter. I remembered that.
Good for you.
Still had no dementia.
You say it again?
Toxic characteristic leachate parameter test. That's basically what defines a hazardous waste. If I don't know that it's one of these things, or if I don't just declare it, I can basically state that this waste that I have is a hazardous waste, and I dispose of it as a hazardous waste. I don't have to necessarily analyze it. But if I want to take it to one of these other waste disposals, now I have to do the TCLP test to prove that it's not a hazardous waste. So here's where the DNR is going to maybe come in and do some inspections. Maybe they go to one of these other disposal sites. There's one out here on Wrangell Road that you take all this special waste to. And before they will take it in, you have to do certain protocols to make sure that it doesn't contain anything hazardous. But should you get something in there that is hazardous, you might have to go back and clean out a whole cell in one of those landfills. And that can be costly. If the DNR comes into your facility and they look at your waste determination, which we're going to talk a lot about waste determinations, and you have all your waste that you generate, everything from the hazardous stuff down to cardboard and bulbs and everything else. And this matrix basically says, this is where I generate it, this is how much I generate, this is how I handle it, this is how I classify it, this is where it goes, this may be how much it costs, and all that kind of stuff. The DNR comes in, they looked at that matrix, and they say, you guys really know what you're doing. And they'll look at it and they'll say, I want to see this storage location. I want to see this satellite accumulation area. And then they'll go out and see, okay, this is exactly what you said. You know what you're doing. And they let you alone because you do know what you're doing. If you get to a point where, this doesn't show up, or maybe this showed up in a landfill and they questioned it and they come back to your facility and say, why are you taking it there? And you say, well, this is my analysis. I took it out to a certified lab, licensed lab, and this is the analysis that I went by. And they go, okay, we'll accept that. We're still going to take a sample of this and analyze it ourselves. And if they analyze it and they find that it doesn't match this analysis, well, at least you tried. You're still going to be on the hook, maybe. Or maybe they'll find out just where does this all go. It's not like OSHA where they just find you and you have to fight everything. The DNR works with you to get it right, which is nice. So this is a section of waste that we're going to deal with a lot because you really have to know what that is before it gets into a cheaper landfill. Next. And this is why. If you look at all these things, all those solvents, what should be the ultimate disposal for all those solvents? They should be either burned or used for secondary fuels, right? You don't landfill solvents. That just doesn't make any sense. Incineration, you take it to an incinerator, you throw in natural gas or whatever, BTUs to make it burn. It goes to 99.9999, 6 nines, destruction. It's gone forever, basically. It's the most expensive way to dispose of something. Secondary fuels took a look at that and they said, look, if you're burning an awful lot of stuff that really doesn't have to be incinerated. There's BTUs in there. As a cement industry, we're burning rocks. Rocks don't burn real well. And you have to put a lot of heat in there to burn a rock to make cement. So they took all this hazardous waste at a pretty clean site, and they set up a system back about 86, maybe 85, where they took in secondary fuels, and they now burn all this stuff for the fuel, for the BTU values. Still costs something because they have to follow all the regulations, but it's less than incineration. You can, again, recycle it. Like I said, you can take it and somebody can use it. That's a great way to dispose of things. Or you could treat it. Because landfill down here is an option. And some things, heavy metals. Should I be burning those? They don't burn, right? They fall into the ash. The ash then has to be treated somehow. Lead. Is lead by itself hazardous to you? Has anybody taken a lead sinker and put it in your mouth to bite it open? Has it killed you? If you'd swallow that lead sinker, now it gets into your stomach acid and it becomes the lead ion, right? That's where it causes all its harm. So if you look at anything that you've got, any of these heavy metals, barium is another one. You guys use barium a lot, right? Barium is a heavy metal. But lead ion plus an anion, it could be carbonate, it could be silicate, could be a phosphate, sulfate, barium sulfate. These react and go over here to barium sulfate. If you look at this is barium now. There's very little barium in this solution. You have an abundance of sulfate and everything's tied up over here. So that barium ion is tied up in that molecule so hard. It's like 10 to the 12th or up to like the 23rd times more of this than there is over here. So therefore, when you do that TCLP test, that barium doesn't show up down there because there isn't any barium ion. It's all barium sulfate. And that's where your treatment comes into account. Secondary fuels is great because it's a real alkaline environment, right? And all those heavy metals that you burn in secondary fuels becomes tied up in the silicate or the carbonate, and it's used in concrete, and now it's in all the concrete and the roads and everything in the United States. Great way to dispose of it. Or you take that, if I've got a solution that has those heavy metals in it, and I treat it with a sulfate or whatever, and they actually take cement dust and they mix it with the heavy metals. Let's say I've got an acid that I'm trying to get rid of. They neutralize it. They tie up any metals that might be in it in this sulfate or carbonate or silicate, and then they landfill it in one of these hazardous waste landfills. These are really highly regulated landfills that have cells and gradients up and down gradient. So it's not your local landfill that you used to see down at the end of the roads. Then you can look at household hazardous waste and universal waste. And basically, why don't you have to dispose of this as a hazardous waste when you get rid of this computer? Well, you don't have to because it's being recycled. Somebody will take that and they'll take out the electronic boards that will be recycled for its precious metals. They'll take out any connections, any copper, anything that's in there that they can salvage. Or they'll take the computer itself and find somebody who can use it as a computer. Or a printer or any electronic device. So that if you use it if it goes to a recycler, a legitimate recycler who's retorting the mercury out of the bulbs, you don't have to count it as a very small quantity generator or a large quantity. You don't have to count that in your waste generation. Next. So what regulations apply to this? Next. One thing I want you to remember is they're complex. They're hard to understand. I've dealt with them forever. I've dealt with them with the manufacturing end of it. I see how they tried to fit them into the health department, and they didn't fit real well, but that's what you're classified under. And remember, not following regulations can be dangerous as well as costly. Next. It's set up generator types, and this depends on how much you generate in any calendar month. Another thing that they locally did was they said, okay, you're a small quantity generator, but today you've decided you're going to clean out your maintenance shop or your laboratory. And you go and pull all the chemicals out, and now you go over this 220 pounds in any calendar month. I used to tell my clients, do it at the end of the month. Take all the stuff you don't want anymore, set it on this table. You know how many pounds it is. On the 31st, you declare all of this waste. And on the 1st, you declare all of this waste. Keeps you in that small quantity generator status. That way you don't have to fill out a written contingency plan. You don't have to go through all the extra training. You don't have to do all the bookkeeping that is necessary. Well, EPA said, this doesn't make any sense that you're doing that. We're going to give you an episodic generation, and you can do that every once in a while. Just let us know. Or you have a spill, and you become this. They don't want you to say, okay, I'm a very small quantity generator. Tomorrow, I'm a large quantity generator. I have to follow all the rules of a large quantity generator. And then next Friday, I become a small quantity generator again. They don't want you to do that. So they went through and they changed that. And the DNR had to adopt those things also because it's less stringent than the regulations. So it depends on what you generate in any calendar month. And as a large quantity generator, it can be a large quantity. You notice these numbers, this is back in 1976, because any day now we were going to go on the metric system. This is, 1,000 pounds, 100 pounds. So that kind of shows you about what you can generate each month and stay under those classifications. Now you'll see this acute hazardous waste. These are those things that we talked about, like the nicotine. And the nicotine rinses from the containers. If you go over 2.2 pounds in any month, you become a large quantity generator. And you have to follow all those regulations. So this is what they set up as the generator types. And then they set up different things that you have to do for each generator. Next. Remember, it's the P-listed waste that you have to keep track of. And that's why the odd numbers metric system. Next. They also said, I'm a large quantity generator, and I have several little clinics that are very small quantity generators. I can take that waste and I can consolidate it as a large quantity generator. Now, they didn't say I can consolidate it as a small quantity generator. So there's kind of a gap that they really need to cover later on. We talked about one kind of generation next. They gave you a number, and that stays with the site. This is the way the EPA tracks how much hazardous waste was generated at one site throughout its entire lifetime. Next. Remember, as a very small quantity generator, they said you don't need that number any longer. This is another change that they had. You can ship things on bills of lading. You don't need to follow a manifest. In fact, they don't like to see it on a manifest. But remember, you still need to prove where your waste was taken because this liability is still sitting out there. Okay, next. There's a preliminary bill of lading that follows all the DOT regulations because any hazardous waste is a hazardous material defined under the DOT. Next. These follow the solid waste regulations. Solid waste is a misnomer. It can be a gas, it can be a liquid. It's the name of the legislation. So therefore, basically what this says, if it's a product, it's still a product. And it's only a waste when you declare it as a waste, or it's used in a manner that constitutes a waste. Next. Cradle to grave responsibility. They basically said you've got to go back and do a waste determination. You've got to set up that matrix. You've got to look at your waste and say, this is what I'm generating, this is what's in the generated waste, and this is how I have to dispose of it. And I want you to keep track of all of those things. Next. Why do you want to do it? It's because it allows you to do proper disposal. Take it to the right place. It also allows you to look at that hierarchy of things, and you may be able to save some money. You know, why send it out for incineration when it could go into secondary fuels? And then it says, starting to lose my voice. Your TSDF has to have a license, so they're licensed to be able to handle your waste. Then they also set up these things that they call land bans. Anybody deal with land bans here? Probably the most useless piece of paper that there is. It basically is a document that the disposal site fills out that you give them your waste and your parameters, and they say, okay, this is what's in your waste, we've analyzed it, or you've given us the components, this is how it has to be treated before it can be landfilled. Remember I said it has to be incinerated, and then the ash has to go, so that land ban follows that form, that thing. So what they do is they then say, okay, here's the treatment standard that it has to follow. You give that back to us saying, this is the treatment standard that I have to follow, and it goes along with your manifest, or your bill of lading if you're a very small quantity generator. All you have to do is give it to me the first time you send it to me. You don't have to have it with each shipment, but a lot of people do send it with each shipment. But it basically tells me, again, how to treat that waste before it can actually get into a landfill. Again, non-hazardous waste has to be documented completely. Thanks. They went through and then they said, okay, we're going to do some classification of the waste. We're going to determine what the disposal options are, the treatment standards, and then we're going to call it these D and F and K waste codes. Next. The P and the U. If you have P-listed waste, you should know it, because those are the really nasty things, the methyl ethyl deaths of the world, so to speak. The flammables that are really, really flammable, like ether. The toxic that are really, really toxic, cyanides, things like that. Those are P-listed waste. Everything else is really kind of U-listed waste. So if you go into your laboratory and you've got pure xylene, pure NEK, pure methyl cyanide, that basically is a U-listed waste. Next. Again, if it can be used for its intended purpose, it's not a waste. Next. Some wastes that are excluded, we talked about lead. You've got stainless steel maybe. You've got aerosol cans. If they can be used for the metal recovery, they're excluded from your hazardous waste quantities. Anything that goes down the sewer in the lab isn't counted. Anything that's electronics or universal waste, if it's legitimately recycled, it's no longer a hazardous waste. What they want you to do then is assign the right waste codes. That's why you take your waste and you send it to a disposal company first, and they take a look at it. what they'll do is they'll make sure that they cover all the waste codes that it might be in there, because like toluene can have a U listed waste, it can have a F listed waste, it can have a D listed waste. And you got to follow each one of them because each one has a different treatment standard and it has to be listed on that land ban form. And the thing is, if you mix waste, you have to follow the most stringent treatment standard. Next. So do I have to analyze my waste? Next. No. If it's hazardous, and I know it's hazardous, I've got the SCSs to prove it. I know from generated knowledge that it's hazardous waste. I can dispose of it and declare it a hazardous waste because it's the most expensive and it's the most secure way of disposing of the material. I can do that anytime I want. On the other hand, if it's a non-hazardous, it's cheaper disposal. I've got to prove that it's not hazardous. And I don't want to get caught, in between that. Going back to the maintenance shop cleanout, you've got a lot of paint. You've got two drums. You've got one that you put all your latex in, and you've got one that you put all your flammable paint in. And at the end, you get two drums that don't fit that latex thing. Can you put the latex in with the hazardous waste? Yeah, because it's going to be disposed of in the most expensive way and the safest. If I have two drums left over, can I put those two in the latex waste? I can, but now what have I done to this latex drum? I've made it a hazardous waste. The whole thing has to go into hazardous. So that's just kind of an example of mixing waste. Next. Okay, so now they look at it. I've got toluene, and I'm disposing of it. It's the sole ingredient in this waste. I can dispose of it as used toluene. It carries a U-listed waste. Okay, next. And I look it up, and it's either a P code or a U code, depending on what the material is. Okay, pretty simple, right? Next. Then I have to look at how is it used. It's pure toluene. This pertains better to, it used to pertain to the laboratories, but it doesn't anymore. I put it on a rag, acetone on a rag, and I wipe off the markings on a beaker. Legally, before that acetone was an F-listed waste because I used the acetone for its solvent purposes. In manufacturing, you can see this because maybe I'm cleaning parts with a rag. So that becomes an F-listed waste. I can't landfill that. That's the importance of an F-listed waste. It has to be incinerated, basically. The rags can't be used for secondary fuels, so it has to be incinerated. So it depends on how it's used. These pertain to degreasers a lot, things like that. Next. Then you have things that were just defined. These are a couple of them. I don't care what they are, they're K-listed waste. And then the most important one is the next one. Next slide. It's a D-listed waste. And what's important about this is it's a waste. That toluene was a waste. The toluene I mixed into a paint, and I made a paint. And I painted this table. The paint in my can is a hazardous waste that I've got left over. The paint that dried on this table is no longer hazardous waste. Makes sense, right? The toluene is evaporated. This is no longer flammable, so I can dispose of it. The paint in the can is flammable. I've got a little bit of residue in the can. It dries up. It no longer has a flash point. It's no longer a hazardous waste. Another example is acids and bases. I've got an acid that's 1.5 pH. I dilute it, or I mix it with some base, and it becomes 2.5, or 3, or 4. It's no longer a hazardous waste. It no longer exhibits the characteristic of corrosivity. Let's take a look at the next slide. So, D001 is ignitability. The important thing to remember there is the flash point is 140 degrees or less. That's why you have a lot of 141 flash naphtha, because the flash point is the temperature at which you have enough volatilization going that if I have a spark, it's going to ignite. So, yeah.
So is that our hand sanitizer, our 70%
Good example. Let's
alcohol?
talk about hand sanitizer. Great example. I've got a canister of hand sanitizer, and it has to be 65% alcohol, otherwise it doesn't work. I don't know what the percentage is, I guess that's 65. But let's say it's there. I use it, and now it's got an expiration of 3 months. I don't know what that solvent content is, but now I want to dispose of that. If I do a flash point on it, it will flash. So therefore, is that a hazardous waste? Yes. Can I give it to somebody to use as a hand sanitizer? You want to take it home because I know it's 3 months old and I can smell when it's working, and when it doesn't work, I will quit using it. I can give it to you to take home as a product. You get it home. You get it to another part of the facility, but it's not critical. And it sits there. And the solvent evaporates out of it. No longer has a flash point. Is it hazardous waste? No.
But
Doesn't
you
exhibit the characteristic of flammability.
Yeah, but you treat it as one because you can't prove that it doesn't have a flash point.
You can. You can do flash point test on it.
Nobody's
going to do it. No,
Nobody's
it's
gonna
more.
do
It's cheaper to get rid of it the other way. But that's the example that you can do. Is I have that paint. In fact, the DNR tells you you've got paint, and rather than dispose of it, open it up, paint something, let it dry, so it becomes a non-hazardous waste. They would be very happy for you to take this, open it up, let the solvent get out of it. It no longer exhibits the characteristic. You can landfill it. Now, if you had cases of this that were just expired, and you said, I don't think it has a flash point, so I put it in the cheaper landfill, and they catch you at it, you may have to go back and take all that stuff back out and clean up that site because it did have a flash point, and you just did it the wrong way. So that's where the ignitability is important here. Next. Other things that are D001 are oxidizers, your flammable gases, welding gases, things like that. Your gases in inhalers. What are the propellants in inhalers? Is that carbon dioxide, or is it just compressed air?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
So the inhalers aren't necessarily a good example of aerosols, but let's take aerosol in a paint down the mains. I've got it in a paint can and I use it all up. I can't get any more out of it. I can throw that in the trash. It's not a hazardous waste. I spray it, I use it for a while, I set it there, I go to spray it again, I know there's stuff in it, the nozzle's clogged. That's a hazardous waste. I have to dispose of that as a hazardous waste. Next.
For the oxidizers, so we use a lot of like hydrogen peroxide, oxycide in disinfectants.
Mm-hmm.
So those are delisted, right? Because of their.
There's a percent oxide that is in there that would react.
In its
Hydrogen
concentrated form.
peroxide, what?
In the concentrated form.
Yeah, that has to be, what, 65% or something like that. Your other oxidizers, I don't know what other oxidizers you may have. We have calcium oxide that we have in one of the products that I deal with a bit. But, basically, they add to a reaction. Oxygen tanks. Not hazardous, right? Not flammable. Even though you saw that fire over in India or wherever that was, or the hospital where it killed so many people, that got that oxygen tank. The oxygen tank didn't blow up and cause the fire. It added to whatever fire was going on because it helps it burn real well, but it doesn't burn by itself. But these are spray cans we talked about. Next. Getting to your corrosives. Anything with a pH less than 2 or greater than 12.5 is a corrosive liquid. Now, the DNR and the EPA allow you to mix these two together, or they allow you to dilute them down to get them below these pHs, because all they are is acidified water or basic water, and they will allow it to be disposed of in that landfill because it reacts with everything and neutralizes and it becomes water. Sodium hydroxide, another example. It doesn't have a pH, solid sodium hydroxide. So it's not a hazardous waste. It's a DOT hazard, but it's not a hazardous waste. And if you think about it, sodium hydroxide in a landfill, who cares? You know, it becomes sodium, which is in everything, and hydroxide, which is half of water. So, you know, it really doesn't matter. Also, the corrosives can be something that corrodes steel, like ferric chloride. You have to have some of that. Next. Next. Again, you can mix those things together, but you can have no other treatment. You can't have any other heavy metals in there that form a hydroxide and fall to the bottom. That becomes a treatment, so you have to have a treatment license to be able to do that. Next. Sulfide or cyanide containing materials can be a D003. Next. And then we talked about the TCLP, and this is where this falls in. Next. I do that analysis, and I find that my dissolving of whatever material I had to analyze, I come up with over these levels in here of any of these constituents. And you'll see that, you know, MEK is in here. Very familiar with MEK, methyl ketone. It's a solvent. It's flammable. It carries a U code. D code, if it's over 200 parts per million. It can carry an F code. All of those different things depending on how it's used. Next.
So on that last slide,
yep,
a lot of those components are in, so like selenium's in a multivitamin.
Yeah.
So if you have a bunch of multivitamins that people are disposing of, that's going to take you up.
What is the selenium contained in? It can't be just free selenium. It's selenium with another anion. And if you probably did an analysis of that, you may not get enough free selenium to come out to make it hazardous waste. But supposedly you had a bunch of those that you want to dispose of. You might have to do a TCLP on it to see if you get enough free selenium over 1 part per million. Might be hazardous waste.
Or if you don't have that, you just put it in hazardous, and then it's probably cheaper than trying to get somebody else to dispose of it. Yeah.
Okay.
So all of you will have a RCRA quiz. If you, it's the first one that's there.
Yeah.
Okay, these will be your first sections of review of the rules and regulations.
I don't know what time it is, so you get to the point where somebody wants a break, and we're
Yeah, I think,
portion in here after this. If we want to take a break, let's take a break.
okay.
Okay. First thing I said, hazardous waste disposal is highly regulated and complicated, and therefore it must be followed precisely. That's what I want you to get through with anybody that you're going to get playing with. If they're going to throw something away, they come and they ask you first. The following regulations involves reducing liability for possible cleanup costs. Following regulations, yes. Acute hazardous waste are P-listed waste and are extremely hazardous to personnel and the environment. True. Okay. Next. Characteristic waste, when neutralized or evaporated, continue to be classified as hazardous waste. No, it no longer exhibits a characteristic. If characteristic waste D, listed above, no longer exhibits that characteristic, it's no longer a hazardous waste. Okay, that's the important thing to remember about characteristic waste. If I mix two waste types and I make them less hazardous and reduce disposal costs, am I going to do that if I mix two hazardous wastes? No. Now, the exception is acids and bases, right? But otherwise, if I mix two waste types, I make it 2 times the most important, the most strict one there. Next.
I did it, sorry.
Okay, you want to take a break now for a few minutes? What time is it?
Or why don't we just do these last few questions and then we'll take a break?
Oh,
Yeah, you got
oh,
3
we
more
put these in
questions.
here?
Yep.
Okay, analysis is required for all hazardous waste. I have a hazardous waste. I'm going to dispose of it as a hazardous waste. Do I have to analyze it? No. I can just declare it a hazardous waste. Testing of non-hazardous waste is more important than testing of hazardous waste if the non-hazardous waste is being disposed of as a non-hazardous waste. True. Here, putting a non-hazardous waste in with hazardous waste can make the hazardous waste non-hazardous.
False.
Okay.
So, what's important is to get to know your waste. Next.
Okay, hang on. There we go.
We do have a whole presentation. I went through NR 526, and this tells you how to seal red bags and when you can open them to inspect them and how they can be transported and all this kind of stuff. We're not going to go through NR 526, but the whole PowerPoint presentation is available, and you can get it from Lisa if you want. Waste identification. We've talked about this already. Next. If you're going to use your own knowledge, that's fine. If you do use a lab, it has to be a licensed laboratory. You have to keep your records on all these wastes for 3 years. Material safety data sheets can be the most important way to identify hazardous waste. And again, non-hazardous waste are a different story. Next. What we want you to do is what you generate, what the waste codes are, what your generation rate is, where does it go. If you've got any analysis or generated knowledge, keep all that in that form. Next. This is a good example. This is something that shows you some of it. There's a better one next here. That's the next one after that, I guess.
Let me click it.
Maybe we took that out. Go back one. Okay, again, RCRA and the EPA deal with hazardous waste. The DOT involves transportation. And they'll tell you what kind of containers you can use, the papers you need, the labels, and the regulations. Right? So once you've got this ready, you have to package it according to DOT specifications. You have to use the right container. You have to label it correctly. You have to mark it according to with the proper shipping names, emergency numbers, and things like that. And then you have to have that statement on there that federal law prohibits the improper disposal of this hazardous waste. Next. We talked about land bans. They have to be with each shipment, right? Or with the first shipment, actually, but most of the shipment. Dilution is not a solution. We talked about that before. If I mix waste, I just make it more expensive. And this goes, it really makes a difference in your medical waste. It doesn't so much in the hazardous waste industry because it's probably all going to secondary fuels or incineration in the first place. But once you get in and you start making dual waste, you can be very expensive. Right? Land bans we've gone over. VSQ is exempt from them. Next. Emergency information. This is a change in 2019 or 17. It used to be that the large quantity generators had to fill out a contingency plan. It has to be in writing. small quantity generators had one. And what they did is they sent it to the local emergency planning commission, and then they send it to the hospitals. So you got a copy. That I don't know if the hospitals knew what they were getting, but it basically said that I've got a facility here and I deal with these hazardous things, and you might get somebody that might be contaminated with these things. What they said now is for small quantity and large quantity generators, you should have a list of the hazardous things that you have in here. Let the local emergency planning commission know what you've got at least every 4 years, if not before then when things change. So this is new. When you get to emergency preparedness, if you have a large quantity generator, you have a contingency plan. So you guys have a contingency plan. You probably don't as a small quantity, but everybody has a contingency plan of some sort. But as far as required by RCRA, just the large quantity generators are required to have it and have to be in writing. And then they say there's a few things that have to be in there, and they list them in NR 600. It's actually in 662, right there. But for the most part, hospitals will always have all of this. But you have to have a device to summon emergency assistance and internal communications. This was written before cell phones. Portable fire extinguishers, if you have flammables. Something to spill control. And then safety equipment like eye washes, things like that. If you've got corrosives, you have to have an eye wash. Someplace where if I spill it in my eyes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be corrosive, it could be good for anything. I need to either have the bottles where I can spray out my eyes until I get to an eye wash station where I have 15 minutes of water that will wash out my eyes. It has to be written. If you're a large quantity generator, it has to be part of your contingency plan. Okay. You have to update it every time it fails an emergency, or there was a change at the site, like your emergency coordinators changed, or your emergency equipment changed. You've got in there how to use a ABC fire extinguisher, and you went and got purple Ks. It has to be updated for that. Next. Training has to be done for anybody who's on that contingency plan. It's going to be an emergency responder. And you teach them to the position that they are required to have. Next. They have to be familiar with all of those things there. They also have to be familiar with the fact that when I go back up on site, I'm going to go back in for production, or I'm going to go and reopen and go back to normal operations. I have to notify the DNI that I'm going back up because they want to know that your fire extinguishers are there and you've got the right equipment, things like that. Next. Training has to be done by these people within 6 months, or they have to work with somebody during that time who is trained. They have to take part in an annual review. So if you've got hazardous waste people, and you've kind of identified who those people are, they have to be kind of taught about hazardous waste a little bit. You can use some of these slides to do that, or the job that they perform. And even if you're just the purchasing agent, and you talk to Mary to find out what containers you need, and they tell you what containers, that person is really a DOT dry protect person because they are choosing those containers. Next. Oh, titles and jobs have to be written for like one of these job descriptions. Okay. Question 10. Land ban forms identify the treatment standard for the specific waste that's being offered for disposal. True or false? True. Getting to know your waste helps reduce cost of disposal. True, Kim. Knowing your waste streams allows for better disposal of hazardous waste. Next. Storage regulations. Okay, so the storage regulations pertain to the hospitals, and we really need to kind of go through this. Next. You have each either 90, 180, or about a year to dispose of these wastes from the date that those containers are full. And it depends on what type of generator you are. If you are one of these, you cannot accumulate more than that many times 6. Otherwise, you just prove that you are a large volume generator. Thanks.
Michael, so if we have a small clinic out anywhere and they do accumulate a small amount, we need to make sure that that's going out the door at least annually.
They like to see it there. There's really no limit, but to be a well-managed facility, you kind of like to see those things go out at least once a year, kind of thing, because they have a tendency to get lost in the back rooms instead, and they're not. And that means that you don't have a good system in place if they get lost and all of a sudden 3 years later you find
That would never happen.
No, I don't think it has ever happened, but it could.
Yeah, it's possible.
There are 2 types of storage, permanent and satellite. Okay, next. Permanent storage location is a place where you take all your waste just before it's going to go out for disposal. Okay? It has to be on a solid surface, impervious, so a rug is not a solid waste surface. Protected from the weather. It has to be contained. A room is contained to a certain extent. It has to be inspected. How do you prove that you inspect it? The DNR will not come and ask for the inspection forms, but I don't know how you prove that you inspect it unless you've got one. And the best way that you can have is have the forms in the room, and the person who inspects it, when the DNR comes, you say Mike inspects it, so Mike goes out, and they say, well, what do you look for? And you say, I look for everything on the sheet right here. Aisle space, the date of the last container, how many containers are in there, whether we've got safety equipment, all the things that are on that list. Has to be labeled. Labels don't necessarily have to be out and showing, but it sure makes it easier for an inspector if they are. So turn them out, but they have to be labeled. It has to be dated. If you are filling that container in the storage location, you date it when the first material goes into that drum. And then you've got 90 days or 180 days to get rid of that drum. Okay? We're going to talk about why that's important when we get to satellite. You've got to protect it from hazards. And you can have as many permanent storage locations as you want, but they all have to follow that criteria. Next. Satellite accumulation. Mary is not going to give you a deal because you've got a half-full drum or a half-full container that you're disposing of. You dispose of it by the container. You don't bill by the pound, do you?
Well, that's why what we do now is we consolidate for you, where we have people come and move it into containers so you get full use of your container.
Yeah.
But,
So satellite storage was set up so that you can fill the container before you have to dispose of it. It's a nice thing that the EPA and the DNR did for you when they promulgated this regulation. Next. It has to be near the process. So the nurse's station or whatever, where you're generating the waste. The largest container has to be less than 55 gallons. Again, this pertains mainly to manufacturing because how many hospitals have 55-gallon drums in their nurse's station? When the containers become more than 55 gallons, you have to move them to permanent storage location. I think that this should be amended for hospitals and things to say when the container is full, it should be moved. But this is the way the regulations are written. You date it when it gets to that 55 gallons. So again, this is kind of a regulation that doesn't necessarily apply, but you still have to date it. And you've got 3 days from that date to get it down to permanent storage. And that's consecutive days, not working days. It has to be closed. It has to be in containment. It has to be closed unless you're putting something in or taking it out. It has to be labeled. And You have to label it as a hazardous waste, whatever it is. Plus you have to say, OSHA came through just recently and said, as an employee, and it's a corrosive in the lab or whatever, you've got to let that employee know it's a corrosive. You've got to let that employee know it's a flammable. So they said, you know, those DOT stickers are nice because they let you know what the hazards are. And you can have as many satellite waste streams as you want in one location. Okay, so I've got a laboratory. I can have satellites for acids. I can have satellites for bases. I can have satellites for solvents. I can have satellites for heavy metals. You know, whatever I want in that location. Next. The dates have to be visible, and it has to have the words hazardous waste on the label. Any leaking or poor condition container has to be refilled immediately. And remember, if you've got something spilled on the outside of the container, that's a spill of hazardous waste. Right. If you're using a reused container, it has to be compatible with the material you're putting inside it. In other words, acid can't go in the metal container, things like that. Keep it closed. Handle it in a way that will prevent rupture. And they have to be inspected weekly for leaks and deterioration. And again, that thing, inspection log will let you know that. Next. If you do have incomplete waste, you should store them in separate containers, obviously. Any container that you use, and you're allowed to use a hazardous waste container that's a UN rated container for one trip to a recycler. And if you had something in there that was not incompatible, you should wash it out before you put things in there. And it's best to have a physical barrier in between hazards. Right. Satellite accumulation has to be near the point of generation. You can only have 1 quart of that acute hazardous waste at any satellite location. Next. Satellite containers have to be kept closed, marked, 3 days. And OSHA requires you to have the hazard for the hazard for the exhibit. Next. Just another recap of your storage limits. And if you're sending things over 200 miles, you get an extra 90 days as a small quantity generator. As a very small quantity generator, remember, you keep it under 220 pounds. You never generate more than 2.2 pounds of any acute hazardous waste. You then have about a year. You have to remember to maintain your universal waste. They have to be legitimately recycled. And then you don't have to have any manifest in some of the other training requirements and things that you may want to do. Why you wouldn't want to do training on this is beyond me, because you want people to do things right. Next. You don't have to count things that have been set off site or something that's treated on site. Waste and accumulation areas. Okay, we're going to talk about that. So legally, you're supposed to go to the satellite accumulation area and say, okay, weigh this container. I've got 6 pounds in this satellite. And that was at the beginning of the month. And at the end of the month, you go and weigh it again, and I've got 7.5 pounds in there. Nobody has ever done that in the entire history of RCRA. But, you know, that legally you could get into that situation should you do one of these things and the DNR is really mad at you. They may come and find things like that. But you're supposed to count that, but nobody does. Next. If you manage your waste, universal waste properly, you don't count that. Anything that goes in the sewer and the laboratory, you don't count that. Container residue, you don't have to count that. Next. Okay, so review of storage regulations. Small quantity generator can create 2.3 pounds of acute. No, 2.2. Large quantity generators have no limit on the amount of hazardous waste they produce. The storage is limited to 90 days. VSQGs have no time limit for storage of hazardous waste. True, but they like to see it in a year. Okay. For large quantity generator, permanent storage locations must have drums dated less than 90 days from today's date. If I went there today and I looked at the drums in a large quantity generators, permanent storage location, every drum should be less than 90 days.
Sure.
Permanent storage locations must have adequate aisle space for inspection and the travel of emergency equipment. Yes. Now, at Hydrate, we were allowed skids with 2 drums and skids with 2 drums, so we could have 4 drums across, all the way back, 3 high, because we could walk down and we could look in. They figured you could look in 2 drums, and on this side you could look in 2 drums. So if you've got containers, you know, put your aisle so that you can see the container inside, and you know, you can prove to the DNR that you are inspecting this. Satellite storage allows for generators to fill a container before having to dispose of it. True. Okay, a little bit about universal waste. And again, like we said, as long as you're legitimately recycling them, you don't have to declare them as hazardous waste. Next. They meet the definitions. Again, when the DNR inspects, it used to be back in the 70s and 80s, they looked for drums leaking and down the hill into a ravine and all that kind of stuff. Now what they're looking at is, I've got those bulbs, okay, those universal bulbs, and I put them in my maintenance area, and they're sitting in the corner, leaning up against someplace where I can't get them. Is that legal?
No.
No. They have to be in a box. They have to be labeled, because regulation says that they have to be closed. I've been cited many times because the maintenance crew did not close that. The DNR inspector is there. They like to see that. They like to tell you that it has to be closed. You close it. They write on their thing, I found something, and they corrected it immediately. They did their job. You did their job. You know, if you're going to give them one, that's the one to give them. Can I have new bulbs sitting in the corner?
Can you have what?
New bulbs.
Yes.
Yes, I can have new bulbs sitting any place I want. Who's got more mercury in it, the new bulbs or the old bulbs? The old bulbs, I think they're taking the mercury out now. You know, still, they can regulate the hazardous waste. Okay, so if you don't meet those, you have to treat them as hazardous waste. If you know, if they aren't hazardous waste, they still have to be managed as solid waste, and they have to be handled well as far as labeling, dating, closure, which we talked about, and containment. Next. What do you do with a broken bulb? I've got a bulb that I went to put in my container, and I dropped it, and it shattered into a million pieces. What do I do with that?
No problem.
Sweep it up.
Where do you throw it away?
Seal it and label it.
Put it in with.
Does it go in with your Sharps box? No. It goes out with your universal waste.
Next. We skipped one there, didn't we?
We are right here.
Okay. You know, it just eases the burden on people, and as long as they're legitimately recycled, they're fine. Okay. Employees training, we covered that. Leak proof, have lids and batteries, labels.
So the training, is the training part of the hazardous waste training, sort of the first bullet? Is that-
Yeah, you really want to train, your maintenance shop probably handles the bulbs.
Yeah.
Your electricians probably take the ballast out, but the maintenance shop knows that the ballast should be, they just can't go in the trash. Even normal bulbs have to be handled correctly. You probably take all your computers and printers and everything and they're gone out to recycle, but they're handled correctly. The maintenance staff is probably in charge of all of that, and as such, they have to be trained in universal waste.
So batteries.
Batteries,
Battery.
We're gonna get into
we're gonna
the,
get to that
Okay.
next.
All
Yeah.
right. I see that it
hold
says
that thought.
they must have lids. And
Okay,
Okay, next. Electronic wastes have heavy metals in them. They also have some valuable things in there so that they want to be recycled correctly. Batteries. Okay, you've got different types of batteries. Alkaline batteries can be thrown in the trash. Okay. But how many people know an alkaline from an ICAD, from a lithium ion, from a lead?
I do now.
Yeah, well, you know, if you tell people they can throw all batteries in here and then I'll sort them, that's probably the way it should go. But if alkaline batteries can go in the trash. The other batteries have to be stored correctly. They have to be labeled as used batteries. You have to either discharge the cells or tape the terminals, and you can cause a fire. And every once in a while, I'll take off my hearing aids and put them in my pocket, and I'll get batteries down in there with my change, and all of a sudden my pocket is extremely warm. They do generate a lot of heat. The plastic bags, tape terminals, make sure they don't come in contact with each other. Lead acid are not as critical as the other ones, but they can cause a fire. Next. Bulbs, I think we've talked about all of those, and we want to talk about the breakage bulbs, so I think we covered that. Anybody who has mercury-containing devices, get rid of them. If you are collecting them at a hospital because people are bringing in thermometers or whatever, make sure you don't spill them or break them. Used oil, again, it's a BTU value, so you can get rid of it and somebody will take that. It can't be landfilled. You can't spread it on the roads for dust control anymore. If it is have a characteristic in there like halogens, it has to be treated as hazardous waste. Next. Ballasts used to have PCBs in them. The problem with mixing the PCBs is like a dual waste. You're into TSCA, and TSCA and RCRA disposal sites are few and far between that they can do both of them. So you don't want to mix those wastes. So that's why your ballasts are really are taken care of by the electricians now, because they actually get some money for the metals that are in them. Next. Pesticides. You threw this in here.
I did. I told you the DNR has, and what we've done is on our website now, we have, on our blog, we have a free poster that captures all these universal wastes, how to properly label them the way DNR likes it in Wisconsin, and what would be examples of what that would be. So it's pesticides and antifreeze. Do you have those at your facilities? Yeah. Okay, so this is anything recalled, banned, unused. You want to label it universal waste pesticides. But you should also include the original labeling with the item. That's going to be important. And again, the dating is applicable too. You have to make that happen.
Now, do you take these?
We can, but I mean, there's also places that you could go to here in Dane County too.
Yeah. Police will take
drop
a
them off.
lot of them.
Yeah.
Next. Antifreeze. A lot of it can be recycled, so you keep it separate. You want to say anything more on that?
Well, just not to mix it with other types of chemicals because then it becomes unrecyclable. And just the label on it has to be proper, used antifreeze.
Okay, next. Okay, universal waste. Number 19, universal waste does not count against your generation rate if you legitimately recycle it. True. Universal waste includes all those things there. True or false?
True.
True. Because universal waste contain hazardous materials that can be recycled, they must be properly managed and labeled. True. NiCad and lithium batteries must have the battery ends taped and placed in non-metal containers labeled waste batteries before transporting as a universal waste. True. Broken bulbs can be swept up and thrown in the trash. No. We used to call those hinged bulbs.